was a writer editor of Today's Living section in the Montgomery Advertiser for 27 years. Currently, she resides here in Montgomery, a Bible teacher and really an inspirational speaker. She's the author of Assurances and the Best of Madera. She's traveled all over the world, but home is always Alabama. Miss Madera Spencer.
Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here and talk to you today about growing up in Alabama. In adding a little something to, which is very hard to do, that Mr. Walter said, I remember porch life also, and it made me think of the nights when we would gather on the porch and the serenaders would come by. There would be several people who played, some played the fiddle and some had a drum or tambourines, and they would come by the houses at night in the dark, and you could hear the serenaders coming from way off, and all of the neighbors would gather around to listen to the serenaders for our night porch life. My grandmother lived at one time right about 3 blocks from here on Madison Avenue. And at that time, there were no buildings like this around the Capitol, of course. But my 2 aunts, maiden aunts, I might say, who are now 90 years old, used to bring me to town in the afternoon. We would walk from over on Madison Avenue, and the highlight of that walk would be coming up to the Capitol and letting me climb up the Capitol lawn and roll down it in the little bluebells that bloomed on the Capitol lawn. I don't know whether there are any still there now, but when they finish the Capitol and you go and look, see if they still have the bluebells on the lawn. You know, even though I grew up in the time that we call the Depression years, I don't remember ever having a feeling of those Depression years. There were so many things to do, and even though we lived in the city, it was almost as if we had grown up in the country, because almost everybody in town had chickens and ducks and rabbits and all sorts of animals in the backyard. There was no law against it as there is now. And so we grew up in a country atmosphere, even though we lived in a city. And I remember also the days that we would go blackberry picking. And that's something we did all the time when I was a little girl, or fishing in the creeks. And it was a wonderful childhood during those early 20s. But I think maybe one of the things that I especially feel that I'm blessed with is the fact that when I was a child, I had 3 great-grandmothers living and 2 grandmothers and a grandfather. I had 6 grandparents living until I was in the early teens. And 2 of those grandmothers lived to be over 100 years old. So I had the blessing of hearing their stories about how it was even before the war between the states. And one of my grandmothers was born in 1836. And you can imagine the tales she had to tell. And I remember one of those tales particularly that Grandma Adams told was the time that she was riding through the woods. She was reared down in the South Alabama, and she was riding through the woods, and a wildcat jumped on the back of her horse. And Grandma Adams and the wildcat had quite a session before she got where she was going. But it was tales like that that made me feel so blessed. And another thing I've thought about with those old grandmothers who were 2 100 years old and one almost 100 years old was that nobody had ever heard of cholesterol. And they lived in the country, and they ate fatback and turnip greens, and my grandmother said that if you ate onions, it was the best sedative in the whole world. And
but they went up and down